Good morning. Welcome to our online rock class. We're going to take about 10 minutes and look at some Bible facts. So bring your kids around, bring your young people around to the phone, to the tablet, computer, whatever you're watching this on. And we're going to review some simple Bible facts this morning. But I would like to start with the passage that we always read at the start of our rock class. Are you ready? The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Psalm 18, verse 2. The first Bible fact has to do with God, and it is called the God is chart. There are three ways that the Bible describes God. The first one, you should probably know this, God is, did you say omnipresent? That's right. God is omnipresent, which means that God is always, everywhere present. What about the second way that we describe God? We say that God is omnipresent, but we also say that God is, did you say omnipotent? That's right. God is omnipotent, and that means He is all-powerful. So we have God being omnipresent, omnipotent, and now the third way that we describe God. Are you ready? God is, did you say omniscient? That's right. God is omniscient, which means that He is all-knowing. So when we talk about God, let's remember that He is omnipresent, that He is omnipotent, and that He is omniscient. The next set of Bible facts are going to revolve around the Bible. Now, when we talk about the Bible, we believe that the Bible is God's written word. That's very important. The Bible is God's written word. Now, if I was to ask you how many books there are in the Bible, what would you say? Did you say 66? Very good. There are 66 books in the Bible. And the Bible is divided up for us into two testaments. Now, two parts, two testaments. One of them, and tell me, what is the first part of the Bible called? The First Testament. We call it the, did you say Old Testament? That's right. The first part is called the Old Testament. And the second part of the Bible is called the New Testament. That's right. You're doing very well. So here we have the Bible, the Word of God, made up of 66 books and divided up into two testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament. But now, let's talk about the Old Testament for a few minutes. We know there are 66 books in the Bible, but how many books are there in the Old Testament? Did you say 39? That's right. 39 books in the Old Testament. The 39 books in the Old Testament can be divided up into how many parts? Think about it. How many parts can we divide up the Old Testament in? I believe the number is 5. Is that what you said? That's right, 5 parts. Let's review the 5 parts of the Old Testament. The first one we call what? The law. That's exactly right. The first one we call the law. And then the next section, we then say it is, did you say history? That's right. You have the law, and then you have history. And then the next part of the Bible, think about this. What is it called? Did you say poetry? That's right. Law, history, poetry. But now we come to the fourth part of the Bible. Be thinking about this. What do we call the fourth part of the Old Testament, that is? Did you say major prophets? That's right, the major prophets. You have the law, history, poetry, and major prophets. Now here's a bonus question. Do you remember why they're called the major prophets? If you said it had to do with how much writing they did, you'd be right on target. There are more writings in the 5 major prophets per book than there are in the next section. What do we call the next section after the major prophets? We call them you got it, the minor prophets. That's exactly right, the minor prophets. Now, in our study of the Old Testament, we have 39 books, 5 parts: law, history, poetry, major prophets, and minor prophets. Now here comes the fun part. Let's say the books of the Old Testament together. Are you ready? What's the first one? The first one, if you said Genesis, you're right. So let's go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those 5 books make up the law. But now what comes after the law, we said, was history. So let's say the books of history. So we start with Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. How did you do? I imagine you knew all those. Well, let's go a little farther. Let's make it a little bit harder. And let's say the books of poetry. Are you ready? What's the first book of poets? Did you say Job? If so, you're right. So we have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. All right, how are you doing? I suspect you're doing very good. But now let's continue. Now we come down to the major prophets. Let's think about this for a moment. What is the first book of the major prophets? If you said Isaiah, you're right. So let's go. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, Daniel. Now the minor prophets. There's a lot of these. There's a lot of the minor prophets, so let's start with them, beginning with, which one? Hosea. That's right. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Hey, very good. You did it. Now, bonus question. Which of the minor prophets was not known to be a fisherman, but he caught the biggest fish ever? Or more, I should say, the biggest fish ever caught him. Who was it? If you said Jonah, you're right on target. Now we come to the New Testament. The New Testament is divided up into how many parts? Did you say 4? You're right. 4 main parts in the New Testament. Now, what is the first part of the New Testament called? And I'll give you a hint, it means good news. That's right. It's the gospel. So the first part of the New Testament is called the gospel. Now, what about the second part? Well, we refer to the second part of the New Testament as, what was it? History? That's right. History. But then the third part, we look at the epistles. And there are a lot of letters, a lot of epistles in the New Testament. And then the last book of the New Testament, we oftentimes call a book of prophecy. So those are the 4 main parts. You have gospel, history, epistles, and prophecy. So let's talk a few minutes about the gospel. The gospel section of the New Testament tells us about the good news of this particular person. Who was it that came and died upon the cross of Calvary? Did you say Jesus Christ? That's right. Jesus came and he died upon the cross of Calvary. And so the first 4 books carry this message and tells us about Jesus. So let's review the first 4 books of the New Testament. What is the first book of the New Testament? Did you say Matthew? I thought that's what I heard. Good job. You've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's right. Those are the 4 books of the gospel. Now, the next section, history, is real simple. It's only one book. What is the one book that is considered history in the New Testament? Did you say the book of Acts? That's right. The book of Acts tells us about the workings of the apostles, the growth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the growth of the church and the establishment of congregations. There's a lot of wonderful information contained within the book of Acts. But then after the book of Acts, this long next section we said was called Epistles. And that was because this next section is composed of letters written by different individuals to either churches or other individuals. And so let's review those now. The first of the letters would be called Romans. All right, so we've got that, Romans. And then 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude. Boy, that's a lot of them, isn't it? But those are called the epistles of the New Testament. And of course, the last book of the New Testament is Revelation. Now, how did you do? I think you probably did a good job. And if your mom and dad was there helping you along, be sure to thank them for that. We will need to do this again next week, and so we will bring up more Bible facts, and we'll spend a few minutes before we continue with our online study considering some very important Bible facts to help you and I grow. Remember, the Lord is your rock and your fortress and your deliverer. Have faith in Him.